So let me begin. You have a two-page handout. Let me begin by introducing a very eclectic panel on the subject of real-world evidence. And I'm not going to go through the combination of bullets, but if you just read this through yourself, what you're going to see is we each bring a very different perspective and a very different background. We have a background of an academic point of view and a researcher point of view, Carl. Susanna's a clinician. Theresa brings the regulatory point of view. Rodrigo represents MECO and Alianza GIST and the point of view of patients in Latin America. And I have an eclectic background in communicable diseases, and I look at data and information very differently sometimes than my colleagues in the cancer research field. So I set an outline for our team to follow, and I told them, whatever it is that you have to say, including myself, what I want to understand is, have you helped me make a decision tomorrow morning? That the one thing that we can't do, whether we're waiting for a clinical trial, we're waiting for a pharmaceutical company, is we cannot suspend decision-making either from a patient's point of view or from a clinician's point of view. Sometime tomorrow morning, our colleagues from Sloan Kettering, our colleagues from Dana-Farber are going to have a patient in front of you. You're not going to have all the information you want, but nobody's going to tell you to hold your decision until you get all the information you need. You have to make a decision, and so does the patient. And so the question is what is this concept of it? And I presented a brief overview. I think the file is in your, let's see.
Yes, everything's in your folders.
Okay.
For this plan.
But how do I advance the slides, Sarah?
Arrow to the right.
Point go.
Okay. My assistant, Rodrigo Salas.
I'll do it.
Okay. 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 So this definition is not, it may not be the right definition, but I read a lot of articles, and the only thing I could find a consensus on that people agreed to was it's not randomized clinical trials. And yet, obviously, randomized clinical trials are a very important source of data for decision making. Okay. So I want just to present a brief background. I had the opportunity this year to sit in a room with the Vice President of the United States and his wife at the Cancer Moonshot meeting. It was a very interesting room. And they were presenting, everything was being presented in that room from the perspective of big data and massive data, and Carl is going to talk to it. And I was concerned. I was concerned about the medical records that I had seen and that my wife had, and all the errors that was in those records. So I thought a little background would be helpful. And the Raft group began life in the year 2000. And what's happened since then? Number one, molecular testing has expanded dramatically. In the year 2000, we were leiomyosarcoma patients who became GIST patients because somebody had a test called CK. We now have oral drugs, and traditionally oral drugs have replaced many targeted IV drugs, and their consequence to this. And patient survival has increased dramatically for many cancers, including GIST. So that's kind of a background if we're going to start looking at information and evidence. So what's the consequence of this? One is that cancer subgroups have increased, including for rare cancers. We're dealing with smaller and smaller numbers from which we're trying to draw decisions. We have smaller data sets, which makes trials more difficult. More patients are being treated by local oncologists because it is easier to write a prescription sometimes than to send a patient to a center of excellence where they're going to be seen by somebody with more experience. So you see patients, we're depending upon patients to take their drugs. We're depending upon sometimes less experienced oncologists to treat the patients. And the long-term side effects of survival are something we're still struggling to catch up with. And we're beginning to see with our own database in the Raft group that side effects change over time. We're not sure sometimes whether we're seeing background changes caused by aging. We're not sure whether the drug is causing it. But we are seeing patients with different side effects over time than we had before. In contrast, next slide please, Rodrigo. Got it. Okay. Rodrigo and I, by the way, we go back to the first day of the Raft group. My perspective, the patient perspective, cancer research structures and the cancer research culture remain stuck in time. Sorry, cancer researchers, but you probably agree with this. Traditional randomized clinical trials simply cannot provide all the information that we need. Data evidence sharing remains bogged down in a post-publication structure that delays access to data and information for months and sometimes for years and sometimes forever. Clinical trial and research failures often go unreported, which denies access to the crucial information about what not to do. Individual researcher competition remains a reality as opposed to collaboration, although there are bright exceptions, and you cited today. And it's compounded by pharmaceutical competition, sorry my pharmaceutical friends, whose market priorities often remains a reality over what is required for cancer patient survival, such as the combination of drugs. And if we think that we want to combine two drugs owned by two pharmaceutical companies and test them out, it is a daunting task in order to bring that about. As a consequence, Rodrigo, real-world data and evidence is needed, and how should we evaluate it? And what we've done is we've come up with a list of criteria, I won't go through ourselves, where I'm not sure what real-world data or evidence should be. I'm going to let our panel talk about it, but I'm sure it should be accurate. Because if it's not accurate, what use is it? And I'm sure it should be timely. And I'm sure that it should reflect the patient's perspective. And I'm sure it should go across the continuum of patient care from initial diagnosis to the end of life and across institutional barriers. So when a patient leaves one place and goes to another, somehow the information should follow. I'm sure it should be accessible and portable. I think it should support clinical trial recruitment. And I hope it also gives us some health economic data. So I'm not going to go through all the things the Raft group is doing. We're heavily involved in this. But I want to jump ahead, if you don't mind, Rodrigo, 2 slides where we look at 5-year survival rates. Okay. A little bit of perspective, lest everybody in the United States feel that we are the end-all of everything. So I present to you 2 sets of data. And the reason is that one of the things I would hope that real-world evidence should prompt us to do is, if something is working differently in one part of the world, if it's working better, maybe we ought to find out why. So for example, why is it that if you're diagnosed with lung cancer and you live in Japan, your 5-year survival rate is 30.1. But if you live in the United States, it's 18. If you live in Canada, it's 17. If you live in Italy, it's 14. What's happening in Japan, and why is it that patients with this diagnosis are doing better in Japan? I don't know, and I don't pretend to know. But I think maybe we ought to start asking questions, being this is a global group on a global basis. And my last slide is my favorite. So when I was in public health, one of the things we always looked at was infant mortality rates. And we would hope that the United States, because we spend more money per capita in health care than any country in the world. So what's the evidence that we get out of it? So the United States ranks 5th in the United States in terms of under 5 mortality rate, 6.5. Canada, 4.9. Japan, 2.7. I don't know what's happening in Japan, but there are a lot of indicators that show that something is very good is happening. And if you're lucky enough to live in Luxembourg, it's 1.9. So the range in here, I'm sorry, Rodrigo, is in Mexico, the under 5 mortality rate is 13, and in Luxembourg, it is under 2. That is a dramatic difference. And I think one of the things that we need to start looking at as a global organization is not just, do you have access to this, do you see a specialist? What's the bottom line? What is the overall survival rate of a GIST patient in Germany, in France, in Austria, in Costa Rica, and so on in the UK? And how does it compare? And what's going on? What is it? I mean, overall there's a bottom line, are we surviving or not? Having said that, let me turn to our first speaker. And our first speaker is listed at, let's see, get this right, my good colleague Rodrigo Salas, president of Fundacion GIST México.
Thank you, Norman. For quite some years, we have been talking. I'm part of the board of the Raft group also. And we have been talking about gathering information and having a patient registry. And we have been talking about the importance of having enough information to make good decisions regarding treatment. And we began to think, what can we do in Latin America in that regard? In Latin America, we live in a very different situation than here in the US. I was telling my friends over there that we are considered third world countries. The US is number 1, I don't know who is number 2, but we are number 3. And the resources, we don't have the resources to invest in data collection. In fact, most of the hospitals in Latin America do not have electronic medical records. The government also is not spending the money that we need to have statistics. The picture you see on the right, it's I'm with a couple of congressmen, and I submitted a citizen initiative to the government in order to have a cancer register in my home state of Nuevo León. We don't have a cancer registry. We don't know how many patients we have, where are they, and how are they doing in their health. So, talking about big data and patient registries, the first thing that we put on the table is, what do we need the information for? And then we were talking with Sarah, our program director here, is that we don't have enough patients, like, to see how they are doing. Then the question is, and why don't we, as an association in Mexico, have enough patients? Because the patients are in the public system. So the patients are with some doctors, but we need the patients, and they need the information. So last year, there was an initiative called Salud con Datos. And we gathered in Miami doctors and patient organizations from different countries in Latin America, and sat together and begin to talk about what do we need about information. How do we see a patient registry, a database? Do we need the same kind of information? What do you need it for? And that's how we came to a very interesting model that we made here in Latin America. So what do? We collect data from patients. As a patient organization, we need to know how they are doing in their treatments. But for that, we need to get to them. So we made an agreement with these doctors for us to supply labor, let's say an intern, or a grant from the Raft group to pay the salary of someone to begin gathering all the information of the database of the public hospitals. In return, out of the hospitals, we call the patients, and we have an informed consent from them, and we began to build a database. And that way, we follow up the patients frequently. For example, in the case of Mexico, we have around 390 patients, and we talk to them by phone every 2 or 3 months to see how they are doing. And we have an interview that we make, and this information is gathered into this database. So we know how they are doing, are they managing side effects. And are they having the drug from Novartis in this case, or they are getting generics? You have to consider that in Latin America there are a lot of generics. And this way, we also tell the patients what are the questions that they are going to ask the doctors when they go to the appointments. Very low income, very low education, and they don't know how to act with the doctor. They don't know what to ask. So we tell them what to ask, and then we call them to see what are the answers. So with this data, we are beginning to understand how our patients are doing. And also, this data, we give this data back to the doctors so they can take a look at it, arrange it in a way that makes sense to them, and make publications. And this knowledge or this information has been also used to affect in the access to treatment. For example, here you're going to see in this picture, this guy's in the middle, he's the head of the General Health Council in Mexico. So we got to him. In Mexico, half of the population is covered by the governmental health system. In the other half, 10% have a insurance, a personal insurance, so they are covered. But the other 40% of the population is not covered. If they have GIST, they are not going to get treatment. So we get to them in order to ask them to make all the procedures to have GIST covered for this. It's called Seguro Popular for the 40% of the population. And one of the information that was very important is that in our database, in our patient registry, we have patients that have had several surgeries. And the cost of a surgery is covered by the Seguro Popular, but not this treatment. So we made all the economics, and we showed them that it was more expensive to treat patients from surgeries than to give them imatinib or sunitinib. So that's one of the uses we made to these databases. And I want to point out that for us, we see a difference between a database and a patient registry. Maybe in a scientific way, a database is used to generate knowledge. But for us, those data are a patient registry, and every line in this spreadsheet is a person. And we talk to them, and we follow them up. So how do we do it? We made this collaboration with the physicians. We got the informed consents from the patients, and then we began to generate knowledge. Here you have in the National Cancer Institute one of our doctors, and here down doctor in Chile. In this Salud con Datos, it was instrumental to be in the same table some of the different stakeholders. Governments were not present. That's the only thing that we are missing. But up to now, Mexico accounts for 380 patients, Chile about 200, and we are going to begin in Argentina with 250 patients. And we already have two publications, poster publications in ASPOR on the left and in ESMO on the right. So our goals in the short term, talking about information and the database or patient registry, is to generate joint papers with physicians from the three countries. In this case, we found a win-win situation model with them. For example, in the case of the doctors in Mexico that are hired by the government, they are part of a national registry list of people, and if they make more publications, they gain points, and that's an increase of salary for them. So on one part, they give us access to their patients, we give them the information back, make the publications, they get some benefits that are important to them. And also very important is that knowing how our patients are doing, we see how our generics are doing in Latin America. So we have had some cases in Chile, for example, that one of the generics was not working well, and there were adverse reactions, and we as patients stood up and made some changes. The same thing happened in Mexico. Fair to say that also in Mexico, in the beginning, generics were being well tolerated by some of the patients, and they were still stable. So we use this mechanism to make pharmacovigilance. On the long term, what we would like to do is to have this network of physicians that we are working with for clinical trials. We were talking about this morning in clinical trials. In Latin America, we have very few, very, very few. But now that we have the patients, and now that we have the doctors, the leading doctors in this field, in this case, GIS, our goal in the short term is to get clinical trials. So that's all that I have for the moment, and that's how we as patients are using real-world data for benefit for us. I don't know if you have any questions.
This all took place within a year or so. And it is the power of a patient organization to engage the regulatory authority and to build a database for a rare cancer that if you add them all together, it's going to be, what, 700, 800 so far, and we're not going to be finished until we include almost all of the countries within Latin America. So Suzanne, you were listed next. Do you want to, I know you don't have a formal
There's a
presentation.
question over here.
Would you like to comment at the end or go right now?
You had a question?
And there's some questions. There's a question here.
I got a
Sorry.
question.
I think we should take the
What's the
question.
generic that's not working well?
Again,
What's the generic that's not working well?
I need to get back to you with that. We already have information. I don't remember if it was Chile or Colombia. The one from Recalcine, you know?
Yeah, we had a problem with Satan, but it was more of the pharma that's producing hadn't coped with all the legal documents they have done. They had sued, they had to take it out, they had to prove some things in a certain time, they didn't do it. So at the end we won legally and the patient was back on the
Hello, I'm Theresa Mullin. And Theresa, I'm not sure. Definitely don't want to stand in the middle. Okay. And so I work at the Food and Drug Administration. And when Sarah contacted me and spoke more, it was they wanted me to talk about something we're doing with regard to getting more of the patient's voice and getting more real evidence, information from patients. So this is a general talk. I think it's applicable. We did look at some cancer areas in this initiative that I'm going to tell you about, and certainly what we're going to produce from it will be usable, we think, by all. And but this is upstream, as I was telling Norm. This probably is going to be more about evidence that we'd like to see developed in the future, maybe less so about stuff you could just ready to use today, not ready to wear, as it were. And so this starts out with, what is FDA's job in terms of assessing benefits and risk. And so when part of our public health mission, especially for the Center for Drugs, is to do this benefit risk assessment. And it's really a qualitative, semi-quantitative assessment where we take the clinical evidence that's been submitted, anything else we may know about the effectiveness, the safety data that's available, that's already available in some other part of the world. We'll try to look at that data as well, or otherwise we'll look at what's in the safety database that's been submitted to us. And then we do this benefit risk assessment. And there's a lot of uncertainty at the time of approval or at the time of that review because we only have what's in those clinical trials. And as you all know, if you're part of that, I mean, even though that data may be better than a lot of real-world evidence, it often has, it's a limited population that's been studied. It may not be representative of the sickest people who have the disease or and so on, or the full range and diversity of that population. There may also be, depending on the study, a fair amount of missing data. So that also creates more uncertainty. So we know we'll learn more, and so benefit risk assessment is a dynamic thing. We'll learn more over time. Maybe some of our uncertainties initially will be resolved as we gain more data, but other new uncertainties may arise. And anyway, it also involves societal expectations. It involves a certain amount of subjective judgment on the part of the people making the decisions. So we have this framework that we use, benefit risk framework, that we structure the 10 gigabytes of information that come in. We get about 1 million pages of stuff coming into us in these applications. We have to look at it within 6 to 10 months, depending on the time frame. If it's a priority drug, 6 months is our goal to really take a look at it. And so what you see here is the first two rows are very important because this is what we call the clinical context. It's to really frame the approach to thinking about risk versus benefit, and how much uncertainty and risk is probably tolerable to the patient and how much would be acceptable to the regulator. How serious is the disease, and what's it like to live with that disease? What's available already? If it's a disease which is serious but there's a lot of good treatments already, we're not going to accept something less effective than what's currently available. On the other hand, if it's a very serious disease, there's nothing available. You know, the uncertainty and the risks people are willing to accept are a lot higher, and we're willing to accept a lot more uncertainty too. So it's very important to understand those top two rows. The benefit is what evidence we have of benefit that was submitted, and then the risks are what you know about the risks at that point in decision making, and then can those risks be managed? Can you put in place some kind of risk management program that really keeps the benefit-risk balance favorable to benefit, and you can put it on the market, assuming that'll work. We realized that in this whole framing that we really didn't have a way to get at patients directly, to understand their view of what it's like to live with this disease and the treatments, what it's like to use those treatments. So, you know, at FDA, if you involve individuals in the patient representative program, they're going to weigh in on what we call a particular matter, which is to say the decisions related to a particular drug, which means we have to do conflict of interest screening, because if you're weighing in on a particular matter, you will have a risk of conflict. So that process takes a while, and in fact, it's not always possible in the point if you're going to have an advisory committee meeting, you want to have patients at that meeting, or some other situation, time limited, you may not get through that screening process. So sometimes the patient you're able to get doesn't have the disease you're going to be talking about, and that's not uncommon. So that's a limited program. This patient-focused drug development effort was meant to get around that by not going into particular drug products, focusing on the disease and trying to have people tell us who have the disease, just tell us what it's like. So we committed to at least 20 of these meetings. We did 24 of them so far, and we've just wrapped that up. In fact, today, last Monday, we had the last of these meetings. You know, the fiscal year for the government ends on September 30th, so we just finished up the fiscal year that completes this program. Yesterday was the start of our new fiscal year. And so here's the diseases that we have covered in this program, and you can see at a quick glance there's a really great variety. We have 17 review divisions, different diseases covered in each. We really did a full spectrum of diseases here, but all of these were ones that the review divisions felt they really needed to hear more about what the patients thought, about what it was like, what they thought about current treatments, and in some cases, including breast cancer and maybe the lung cancer one that we did early on in the first year, non-small cell lung cancer, how they felt about trials, how much risk they were willing to take. Sometimes we have companies come in and propose a benefit that we weren't sure was a meaningful benefit to a patient. It would be, you're going to be exposed to some fairly toxic treatment. You might have another few weeks of life, and how did patients feel about that trade-off? You know, we really want to hear more about that. So here are the questions that we start with asking about the burden of disease. And we ask these questions, like literally these questions come up every time. Every disease area finds these questions relevant. So of the symptoms you experience, which are have had the most significant impact on your life? And you know, what can't you do anymore you used to be able to do? How has that changed over the time you've had this disease? So we try to get a range of severity and ethnic, racial, gender, age in this in these rooms as well, to understand you know, how it is across the spectrum of what varies and what worries people about their disease. In terms of treatment, we say, well, you know, what are you doing today? Not just drugs, but devices, meditation, diet, and people are usually doing the full range of things to try to address their treatment, their disease. And how's that working? What are the downsides of what they're doing today? And if you couldn't have a cure, what would you think would be part of an ideal treatment? What would you really like to see a treatment address for you? People have a lot to say. These meetings take a minimum of 4 hours, usually 4 to 6 hours. Patients who are sick are very tired. They're rather heroically come to the White Oak campus of FDA to talk for several hours about this. We always hear a great deal from them, and we produce these voice of the patient reports. We try in these reports to very accurately capture what people said and the way they said it, because the way they describe it is very important. we found out early on when our facilitator, who was very good, but she would paraphrase things people would say, and they would say, no, that is not what I said, that is not what I have, and they would correct her. And we realized the actual words are very important, you know, and so, you know, what it brought to my mind, because some of my work years ago was in expert decision making, that patients have as well formed an idea about what they have to say to you and what matters and doesn't matter as an expert in any other field. So what we realized is some of our learnings here is that people with a chronic disease, and you might say, well, duh, Theresa, you know, took FDA 24 meetings to figure this out. No, we actually figured out after the first year, we realized this, you know, we're dense, but not that dense. That people with a chronic disease that are experts in what it's like to live with that disease, you know, and then, you know, and also the fact is most of the things, the docs, we had doctors from that review division are up in the front of the room the whole meeting listening, and they would invariably come away saying, you know, I heard stuff I never even knew about this disease. I treat people for this disease, and I see them every week in the clinic, and I never hear this. Well, they didn't have 4 hours for patients to give them a chance to tell what they really think about what it's like, and hear from other patients as well, so that might be part of the reason. But we realized a lot of the chief complaints that people had are not even being factored into the drug development programs. So things that would really be meaningful and a benefit were not even being captured and not even being measured, or, you know, they were not in the data that were being sent in to us. So, and you know, for people with a progressive degenerative disease, the parents of children, an ideal treatment would just stop the progression. I mean, they could just preserve the person's, stop the loss of function, and that would be, in their minds, ideal. So people also were very anxious to try to participate more in any way they could. They do have a life to lead. They're not professional patients. They want to live their life, but they also are willing to do what they can. So that was another important thing for us to understand. We realized these meetings are great, and people would say to us, what are you going to do now? I mean, did that meeting change your decision about a drug? And, you know, as you might guess, the powerful narrative is not a good basis for us changing the decision, and we might even get a new application, and the timing isn't always, you know, the same. You know, getting something in after you've had one of these meetings, it usually didn't happen that way. But the development program may not have even spoken to the things that were being addressed here. So it helped us a little bit with the context, with the understanding of the severity of the condition and degree of unmet need. What we really want to do is figure out how to help tell people to go from these meetings to something that's meaningful and could be measured and collected in trials. So we actually could have it be a basis for benefit. And we'd understand the burdens in terms of safety risks. So with that, this is my chart. You know, and again, this makes the point even more, Norm. Start early is what we were telling a lot of people, especially drug companies and even patient groups who want to know what do I accessible and tolerable to stay in, which we heard a lot about why people did not want to be in trials or couldn't be in trials. So there are a lot of lessons learned on this chart. You have it in your slides. And here's just quickly the 4 areas of guidance that we're working like crazy on this first one. Since the fiscal year started on Sunday, this past Sunday, you know, that first one is due out in June, and we have a public meeting on December 18th this year to talk about it, to bring people together to talk about it. So every one of these guidances has a workshop about 6 months before the draft guidance is due. First one on who do you talk to? How do you try to make sure you've got a good representative swath of the patients that are in this population? How do you try to make sure you're talking to a broad enough range of the people with a given disease? And how do you engage them in that way? How do you engage them, and how do you not ask misleading or leading questions so that you're not trying to unintentionally maybe bias even the information you're getting? The next one is, okay, now you know who to talk to. What do you want to measure? And how do you try to capture a holistic set of measures that's going to go after both treatment and disease burden? And then also tease out what matters the most to patients. And then figure out, and the third guidance is going to come out, is about how do you try to figure out what measures to take into trials? Not all things that matter to people are going to be affected by a therapy. They're not all going to be changed and be a measurable change in by therapy. So what do you want to take into a trial that you could actually pick up on and detect a delta because of the treatment benefit, and then measure that? And then finally, how do you incorporate that into just very practically, how do you incorporate that into trials? Paper and pencil, or are you going to use electronic means, diaries? Just, we're really going to get into the details of what kind of things to think about in terms of how to use it. So anyways, we realized we need to give people a practical pathway to get from these initial meetings, which have been very effective, and people have been running their own meetings like that now in Washington and inviting us to come, to, you know, be able to really start pulling this data in. And perhaps as I was mentioning to my colleagues earlier, perhaps if we have some good instrumentation here by a disease area, we can help facilitate registries' inclusion of this kind of information going forward, because you really do want to know how it's continuing to go in the delivery system. People have access to these therapies, is it continuing to make a difference? Anyway, that's it. I think that's my last thing. Yes?
Yeah, questions. Me, what criteria do you use to select the patient representatives that are going to be part of this commission?
Oh, the patient representative program is separate from this thing I'm talking about. And they basically, if you go to the FDA's website, you can, anyone who wants to be a patient representative or consider it can look into, sign up and look into becoming a patient representative. It's a separate program, and what they would do is give you some training, because they'd actually have you be almost like an extended part of a review, regulatory review team. So you have to learn enough about the regulations and rules and how reviews are done and so on, and advisory committees. But if you're interested in that, I mean, that information is on the website. The Office of Health and Constituent Affairs handles that. What I'm talking about is really meant to be used by sponsors or patient advocacy communities, maybe working together, or researchers who want to, for a given disease area, figure out how to make sure this kind of patient perspective is systematically gathered. You know what people care about. Every piece of potential work product along the way there has value in informing people and giving them some insight. But that's meant to be used by the community of people trying to develop stuff. And develop instruments, develop drugs that are going to use instruments like that to test their effectiveness and safety. So those are guidances. There'll be, the FDA is usually guidance for industry, but there will be FDA guidances, the regulatory guidance documents that'll be issued. There'll be Federal Register notices. I know those are very popular. Everybody reads the Federal Register notice. But we'll be putting these out on our Federal Register, which is the government's mechanism for communicating to the public, imperfect as it is. But we're going to have a public meeting for each of these ahead of time as well. Those guidances will be across all diseases. They should be applicable to all diseases. I mean, we work very closely with people, well, it used to be OHOP. They're moving into the Oncology Center of Excellence now at FDA. But they're very active. Paul Klutz is particularly active in the patient's voice in oncology drugs and so on. So. Yes?
Do you think that there is a way for the advocates in this room to translate what you've just described that happens in the United States to what they can do with some of their regulatory authorities in their countries to provide a patient perspective? And do you have any suggestions?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I'm also involved in is the International Council on Harmonization of Drugs, and it's got a very long name, but it's called ICH for short, International Council on Harmonization. And that's drug regulators from around the world trying to harmonize their standards. And so we've been presenting this to the International Pharmaceutical Regulators Forum, and Kobe Priest is there, and the other regulatory authorities are there from South America, Anvisa, and some others. And so we're kind of socializing some of these ideas with our regulatory counterparts, because honestly, if you're going to run a multi-regional trial, a global trial, you want to collect this kind of information. I agree, Sarah, you do want to have harmonization and acceptance of this. And I've presented on this program in Tokyo, Shanghai last year. I mean, there's interest from different regulators and FDA. We have a cluster. We talk pretty regularly with our EMA counterparts. So we see, once we get these ideas better formulated and a guidance underway, that we can have as a basis for discussion with other countries, that we start moving it into, if we can, a proposed area for international regulatory harmonization, because we just think it would make it a lot easier for anybody in development programs to do. So it's not immediately, you might want to just mention, and you might want to talk to your regulators about the value of this and stuff like that. It doesn't hurt to talk up these ideas, because then they'll be receptive when they come to the ICH meetings, so that might be good. Anything else? Great, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks very much for being here. I was nominated by the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, who are based in Princeton, to speak a little bit about what I know about big data. I also chair the special interest group on the international classification of databases. I don't really have a lot of time to talk about all this, but I just published an article recently which this basically highlights. It's entitled Evaluation of Healthcare Interventions in Big Data, a review of associated data issues. It seems to fit well into what we're discussing. I'm at the University of Illinois, and I'm just a PhD, I'm not an MD. So 2 takeaways from today's discussion. Data access challenges such as data ownership, security issues, and costs often serve as barriers to data access. Secondly, careful thought is required to fully realize the potential of big data to draw accurate conclusions. Well, big data as we know it includes a lot of data in terms of clinical, genomic, social outcomes, economics, claims information. It's quite vast. And it gives us the opportunity now to help improve patient outcomes and care through assessment of treatment effectiveness and outcome prediction in close to real time. I work with EPIC, which is basically used in 70% of US hospitals. We try to hardwire it for such things as predictive models, so at the point of discharge we can identify a high-risk patient who might benefit from being in some program to help prevent readmissions. It's really cool what we're doing. And there's a lot of multidisciplinary partnerships developed across the pharmaceutical industry, medicine and research, and there's a lot of data issues out there specific to validation, linkage, and access that need to be addressed. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I swear I had this conversation 30 years ago, so, but things are evolving, right? So the issue of data validation and linkage is very important because we have a lack of complete or linked information. A lot of databases which claim to be integrated really aren't, yet they say they are, sorry. We have to understand why the data exists and how it colors or influences our interpretation. We need to have some type of confidence in the data component's correctness and accuracy as it becomes paramount for facilitating decision making. This is one slide I like. In terms of business intelligence, these are the things we know and the questions we're asking, whereas for data discovery, these are all the questions we're not asking, the things we really don't know. So there's a lot of missing, lost, and unavailable data from the researcher's arsenal. Key data points are not readily available for integration to large data sets because well, we're kind of limited. For example, I'd be a very rich person if I could figure out how to bring electronic medical records together with claims data into one. I'd be a very wealthy person, I assure you, because that's the that is something I think people are striving for, but we're just not there yet. Many people are trying. There's a lot of data that's not available in terms of reports on patient progress and outcomes. So there's HIPAA concerns, of course, because doctors' notes are sometimes parsed from the databases, and you just really don't know the full picture. Many people, much older than myself, are excluded from the commercial insurance claims databases. In many cases, I work with all kinds of databases, and I like to break it down and look at the specialists and other groups. It's just not there. It's omitted, and data is often lost as well. So there's bias. There's all kinds of bias. There's the community and system-based factors. There's factors just naturally that occur with the processing and storage information within a secondary database. A lot of things get messed around. It's just very complicated. There's a lot of unmeasured and confounding issues when you interpret results. There's all kinds of very smart people out there, I assure you, who have worked out methodologies for propensity score calibration, instrumental variable approach, instrumental variable error approaches, looking at external validation databases and multiple implementation. Some of them are cited here. So there's all kinds of strategies out there that help support data validation and linkage. The big move right now is moving from ICD-9 to ICD-10 codes. That's a very important component of our research right now, and researchers such as Boyd have begun creating tools to help with this translation. It's very important as we go forward to cohort discovery and maybe reducing bias further. We have to be able to match with greater precision. This gets a little bit into the work I do, whereby we do propensity score matching of certain patient populations to help better simulate randomization. There's all kinds of moves afoot in terms of linking populations. We all have a vested interest to create system-level data warehouses with varying degrees of success. Most pharma companies I know of have their own electronic data warehouses. They spend a lot of money having these licenses. The hospital healthcare system I support is very large. They have their own, and people are investing in this. But there's a lot we can learn from what's already happening out there in the world. There's the CRPD database in the UK. Well over 700 physicians contribute to this database. There's the MEPS here in the States, the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey. In Scandinavian countries, there's a lot of healthcare registries, which are very, very good. I don't see anybody from Scandinavia here today, but I'm sure they would pipe up if they had the chance. And then one database I'm beginning to use is the American College of Surgeons National Surgical Quality Improvement Program. Very good stuff. Here's where I come in and do my commercial. I'm not sure if I can do this properly, but I chair a very large initiative at the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, which is basically, we're charged with classifying all databases in the world. And I just wanted to give you a flavor of what we've done so far with oncology. I hope this works. Do you think this is linked?
Let's
Okay,
find
well,
out.
let's see. Something's going on. This is Murphy's Law at its best right now.
Actually, it shows up in Google here. We can try and copy paste.
Yeah. What I'm trying to show you is that we've tried to organize what we know of oncology databases. And I've got a bigger task ahead of me. I'm charged with organizing all databases. And it's due in the spring of next year. We want to be the best out there. So all students and researchers and FDA, I'm just joking, whoever wants to see it can come aboard, and this would be, and ISPOR is funding this all. So it'll be sustained, which is unusual this day and age to have an organization with deep pockets saying we're going to keep this thing going. Well, let's not worry too much about this, because I was only given 10 minutes, right? So I just want to show it off.
It's proud of
Thank you. I can feel it working. No, I can't. Okay. Wrong country. Well, if you were to Google my name with ISPOR and databases, it would pop up. Well, let's just finish up. Oh, there it is. Okay, so I can't do anything on the keyboard here, but basically this is an attempt. It's already obsolete. Sorry, I'm not a very good salesperson. That's why I do outcomes research. It's already obsolete because you've got to keep up, right? So all the new databases that are out there have to be inputted, and every few months they have to be updated. As we know, everything changes. But this is ISPOR's attempt to help you as researchers, patients, doctors, and the like, understand all the different organizations out there, the various databases available, and the seminal articles that come from these wonderful pieces of work. I'll just wrap up now. Thanks, Sarah.
Now that you did your plug.
Yeah, I got to do a commercial once in a while. So there's a lot of issues related to data access. The question who has access to information in terms of data ownership, security and privacy, cost and availability. We talk about registries, and you've talked about registries. Governance is a big issue, because if you're having the FDA and pharma at the table, you bet somebody wants to be at the table. Guess who that might be, sorry. It's difficult because not always do pharmaceutical industry folks are allowed the boards for some reason, but they belong there as a stakeholder, and I'm just saying that. I'm looking at Blueprint right now, but I'm thinking of everybody. There's a lot of emerging partnerships between public and private organizations which help researchers' abilities to access data. There's the Moonshot, is it called the Moonshot program with former President Biden? Yeah, there's that one. There's all kinds of risk assessment plans, established data networks, and all types of different research programs. I like this slide. It speaks a little bit to what you were talking about last night, Norman. We start with the science. It creates the evidence that comes into care, but it doesn't happen right away, right? There's a bit of lag time. So much of the wonderful work that you're hearing about here, it may not necessarily reach Dr. Tapp's desk. Or I'm just being facetious. You go to ASCO, I'm sure you hear it all, right? So yeah, yeah. And then there's the various, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but there's firewalls in terms of when you do queries and then you want your answers. All this has to be worked out. It's very complicated. And then there's the Sentinel initiative from the FDA, which is very complicated. But the point is, you submit your query, the data partners retrieve the query, they review, the data partners review and run the query, they review the results, and then they spit it back to you. You get an aggregated piece here, which is very cool. So in conclusion, there's a lot of opportunities to accurately assess treatment effectiveness and outcome prediction. I find this very exciting. You have to realize that the potential of these data sources to draw accurate conclusions. A lot of careful thought, a lot of gaps exist right now. Missing data, for example. And we're very much still in flux in terms of data ownership, security needs, and cost, often serving as barriers to data access. And that's all I really wanted to say. I do have an article out there a couple months ago, which is in a journal called Pharmacoeconomics, and it says everything I just said if you want to look at it slowly. Thanks very much.
You're combining many databases. They all.
Well, we have 44 questions which we ask each database vendor. At the end of the day, all I really wanted to get out there for the sake of keeping it, making sure it's no longer redundant, is to have a point of contact. And these people change all the time. URL, that means a web page link, and some appreciation for what the database has. Maybe in 140 characters, or as Twitter does now, 240 characters. It's just an opportunity for you, the researcher, to screen, because we're talking thousands of databases here.
Yeah, it's quite a challenge to combine all this data.
Yeah.
Have you ever considered looking at patient-generated, unstructured data? If you look at especially the rare cancers like this group, they are quite active discussing among themselves their disease, their treatment, their quality of life. There's a huge amount of information in these discussion fora. And have you ever thought of extracting information from those sources? I'm working on a project in the Netherlands where we do this kind of text mining, and you will find unexpected answers on questions that you have not thought of.
It's very, very expensive to do what you're describing in terms of the labor and the manner to transcribe it into a database. I pay a hospital, believe it or not, upwards of $50,000, maybe $60,000 a year to do that work for us. but the point is,
I'm using just the text of the discussions, and we do natural language processing.
So you do machine
learning techniques, yes. The things that Google and Facebook do to give you the best advertising.
Social networks are part of what we're thinking about, because that's part of the future.
That's what I'm talking about, yeah.
We're just trying to meet a deadline for the spring next year. Good is great. Excellent, I don't know.
But if you're interested, I'm happy to share with you.
Thank you. I'll take you up on that offer, because that's probably where we need to go.
Combination of this. this informal source with all the structured data that you have in these databases, I think is really what we have to do.
And there's sorry, you said second world, third, I don't know what second world is either, third world countries. I did a lot of work in pharmacoeconomics in 4 Latin American countries in 1990. That was all based upon piggyback economic evaluations on trials. At that time, there were no databases, and now there are. I mean, maybe not necessarily in Mexico, but Brazil for sure. Argentina, I know, because Federico Odeskalski from Buenos Aires tells me so, so it must be true. But there's a lot going on now, and yeah, we've got the States. Sorry, I'm very, very U.S.-centric. I just became a U.S. citizen last week. I swore loyalty, so I have to play along now. I really do believe that the States has a lot going for it in terms of sophistication, but Europe has patient-reported outcomes because it means something there. And I'm not sure where we're at here. I'm being facetious for decision-making.
So I have 2 comments. First, welcome to America. and the second, I want to tell you the J story. Tell us briefly. So my wife was a patient at New York Presbyterian Hospital, very fine hospital. And because of the relationships I have with the hospital, she was a VIP treatment. She really was treated very nicely. But she was depressed, and she wanted to see a rabbi. And finally, I interceded the last day she was in a hospital, and the rabbi came for a visit, the chaplain. I said, "Where have you been?" And he had a computer printout, and he said, "You see, you made it to J. You're Jehovah's Witness. You're not Jewish." So, okay, we're happy to see him. Now, it turns out that she was back in this hospital on 2 subsequent occasions. She's still a Jehovah's Witness. They couldn't, not only was the data system wrong, they couldn't change it. No matter what, they couldn't change it. They could change the billing if they made an error, but there was no system in place to change it. I mention that because when I was at Project Moonshot, and I was at a workshop with the Vice President of the United States who proposed combining all of the electronic medical record systems in the United States into one giant system. And much to the chagrin of some of my colleagues sitting in the room, but I have no idea how I got into this meeting at all. I thought it was a mistake. But I said, why would you do that? You're taking 4 systems, 4 or 5 medical record systems that all have errors in it, and you're putting them together to have a giant error system. Why don't you develop a smart data system where you collect a smaller amount of information and it's accurate? And I have never, my wife stayed on Gleevec for 16 years. She didn't die of GIST, she died of an infection. And because of my background in public health, and I was assistant commissioner of health and what have you, I get it. The number of errors that I came across in her medical records were astounding. Diabetes, she didn't have diabetes, where that came from. I mean, just one after another after another. And there was no system in place to change it, even when you tried to get somebody to do it. So that's my concern about, just to start it off. But before I give you a chance to respond, we're going to let Suzanne give a presentation, and then.
I didn't have a presentation.
No, we're going to ask you.
Tell us what you think. But I can tell you what I think.
Okay.
No, I think each of these presentations was fascinating, and I think each one brings a different perspective to this, the concept of real-world data and evidence. I really was struck by a comment that Rodrigo made early on in his presentation, which is, when you think about data, you have to think about why you need the data and what its purpose is. And I think that, and I think that informed each one of the directions of the work that each of you is doing. And I think from the clinical perspective, or sort of in the room perspective, we try to do the best we can. Always try to do the best that we can, balancing evidence that we have by traditional means, putting that into the context of the patient's priorities and goals. And then we also have to take into consideration some of the constructs in which we work, which is the payer system, which we really haven't talked much about. I do feel that I think the clinical trials world right now in oncology is moving really fast. And we are in a place right now where we're actually developing more data than we've had in a long time, especially in GIST. I think we have to let the data mature though, because I do think that there's opportunity for us to introduce harm if we are not cautious about gathering a complete data set. But again, I think that that also comes back to a personalized approach of evidence-based decision-making priorities from the patient perspective within the system in which we live.
I have a question. We have been talking about data gathering, but what do you do with the gathering? What has been your experience with Watson Oncology? I understand that where you are, there's stepping some exercises there, right?
Yeah, it's, so, you know, Watson is the IBM platform. I think, you know, I haven't had too much experience with it because what they're trying to do is gather information about experts in the care of disease so that, you know, they can begin to understand how experts make decisions based on the data there with the hope that they could extrapolate that to the real world situation. And as you can imagine, just in sarcoma is low down on the list of what the real world data. But interestingly, you know, more and more we're having larger companies come in that are beginning to data mine. And companies like Flatiron and companies that, you know, are really, you know, saying we can now not only own oncology medical records, we can extrapolate from Epic, but we can, you know, say how that can change real-world application either in the formation of clinical trials and direction of medicine and drug development. So it's kind of overwhelming. You know, I think as physicians, we just want to do what's right for the patient, and we are confident that we're not always acting on the most appropriate information, you know, but I also think it's kind of above our understanding to say how can we bring it all together, and that's why a conversation like this is so important. Where Watson will be, I just don't know, you know, and how applicable it will be, and how will it be able to take the place of personalized care, and how it will fit in with all of the other, you know, data streams that are coming in. Even something like Epic, which we don't have yet, which we may have yet, you know, what I understand, it's not a one, you know, a company that owns all of that, right? They license it out, so it gives free rein to people to come in and mine that data. And there's no propriety of that, so the data can then end up in, you know, the clinical practice, so that's another place to mine the data. And to Norman's point, you know, you have a lot of people coming at a lot of data that you don't know how accurate it is from a lot of different aspects, right? And it's,
I really think the accuracy of the data is a huge issue. We have, you know, this data is being organized to be published, but we've looked at 3 different sort of data elements in our program just for our quality and tracking pieces for a variety of different reasons. Change in diagnosis rate at our facility is about 25% in our diseases and rare tumors. We looked at tumor registry tracking of proper diagnosis, also a non-trivial proportion, which was not correct when you think about sarcoma, because sarcomas occur in any part of the body. So how often are they getting tracked as a breast cancer, or as a retroperitoneal tumor, or by its organs, their site of origin, the organ that it originated in, as opposed to its true histology. And then ICD-9 and 10 coding, I'm sorry, it's a disaster. For rare tumors, it is a straight out disaster. And, you know, it's, and so I think especially as you go towards ICD-10, because it is so minutia oriented, you know, is your tumor in your left ankle on your, or, you know, 3 feet down from your second toe? You know, it's so detail oriented that it loses the applicability in a practice that's volume oriented. I mean, it's very, very difficult. So, you know, I take with a lot of grain of salt when you know, Flatiron and these other companies that want to just come and buy data that's in the medical record, well, that's great, except somebody's got to check to be sure it's actually correct. And so that, I think, is just so critically important.
but I will, so what I was most impressed with is, and I agree, is that patient experiences, right? So real-time data in the sense of patient experiences is worth their weight in gold. And I am a big proponent of the FDA and having a lot of relationships. You know, we understand how forward-thinking they are in trying to get drugs to patients as quickly as they can in the most thoughtful way. And this is just a perfect example because we, although we think we know diseases, do not know diseases. And any one of us who have had a family member who's sick, you know then the disease. And if you think about what you could offer from just the patient experiences, and you then take this into the context to say, how do we build it from the ground up correctly, right? How do we ensure that the data is coming in correctly so that 5 years down the line, you're not worried about the quality of your data, right? That becomes very powerful then. I think, you know, we always have, you know, the critiques of retrospective data, and when we look at our data retrospectively, you know, you're just not thinking forward, and it's always hard to capture everything you want. But I think that to me is a wonderful aspect of real-time data. I spoke about that rare disease that, you know, we're going to go to the FDA soon, and if we don't have a world experience from patients or patients-reported outcomes and understanding what is the correct way to affect that disease, you know, drugs may not get approved for that. The flip side is if they don't, I hope it's made on real-time data, right? You know, and I think that's critical.
One of the other issues is that these databases within institutions. The office last year called me. They were doing a study. They wanted to know the outcome of her surgery in 1998. They had no idea in their database whether she was alive, whether she was well, or what have you. And so what we started doing was we've been building a patient registry now since the year 2000. And we've tried to learn what is it that a patient can tell you accurately, how to record that information. And it's a very labor-intensive registry because the problem is over time, many patients, particularly patients who are doing well, they're not interested at that point in time in reporting back. But we send them an email, we pick up the phone and we call them because we want to be able to track what's happened to these patients over time. And it's remarkable when you talk to patients, what you learn, and when you compare the data that comes out of it and compare it to the traditional data set, it is striking. So a quick story and then back to the panel. So Novartis was tracking Gleevec at 3 doses, 400, 600, 800, one of my favorite stories. And dosage was tracked in the clinical trials and still is based upon intent to treat. It's the starting dosage. But most of the patients in the 800 milligram group in a clinical trial had their dosage level reduced within a few months because of side effects. We didn't know about starting dosage because we weren't researchers. So we were tracking based upon actual dosage. And then we found out we ran our data 2 ways. When we ran it using starting dosage didn't seem to make much of a difference. In fact, our charts and Novartis' charts were pretty much identical. When we ran it by actual dosage, we began to see that the 600 plus milligram group was doing better. This is before we had a lot of mutational data. So we decided to do a study. We tracked, and we published on it, we tracked 169 patients for 14 and a half years. And every year the high dosage group did better based upon overall survival. So what we were doing was what happened was a data concept that began when patients were treated intravenously, when the issue was not change in dosage so much, has not really adjusted to the world of oral drugs. So my second story. So I sit down with a patient who was on the trial, and this patient was assigned to the 600 milligram group. Starting dose is 600 milligram. Novartis has been tracked. Novartis still has it, 600 milligram. And he says, Norman, I got to tell you, he says, I didn't get any shrinkage at 600 milligrams. So I changed my dosage. I reduced it to 400 milligrams until I could build up enough extra pills to raise it to 800 to see whether 800 would make a difference. So our database is tracking this guy, 600, 400, 800. Novartis database has them at 600. And that's what we began to understand that one of the dilemmas when you're dealing with oral drugs is a lot of patients are not taking the drugs that you think they are. And what you think is a treatment failure sometimes is a failure to take the treatment. And so the patient perspective is much more than just how do you feel, and it has an impact your job and your sex life and your ability to function and what have you. It really comes down to the actual efficacy of the drug itself when you're dealing with oral drugs. And so we were fortunate because dumb luck, we did something else. We created a tissue bank. And we created a tissue bank at Stanford University. And what we've done is we were able to match the mutational data from that bank to the clinical trial data that we have in our registry. And we've developed, inadvertently to some extent, I'd like to say we had a great deal of foresight, this amazing correlation over a period of time where we're tracking the clinical histories of patients and we track the mutational status of the patients as well. And that's why our friends are sitting here from different pharmaceutical companies, because if you have a drug and you want to find a particular patient with a particular subtype, we're able to do it. And I'm going to take one quick story and I promise to turn it back over to you. But we had to create a Rube Goldberg system to make it work because we always want to be able to share data. And so our friends from Stanford came out to our office, and the system that they worked out was the tissue actually comes to my office. Paraffin-based tissue comes to an administrative office. We de-identify the tissue. We put the code number of the patient registry on the tissue. The de-identified tissue now goes to OHSU, mutational test, back to the patient's doctor, back to the Life Raft group, onward to Stanford for a repository. But we had to create this patchwork system so that we can actually share the tissue now. And we have a project with our friends at Columbia New York Presbyterian, without violating the HIPAA regulations as well. But it took a lot of creative people to create this system.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, okay, so I just want to add that although it sounds like not much, Norm, to talk about asking people how they feel and how they feel about their treatment. I mean, what we think it's going to be is sea change for us. I mean, if we really, it's a cultural shift for doctors at FDA to say, wait, where are the patients? I mean, it's just, and when we talk to other people, other stakeholders, drug companies, in fact, Citi, the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, did a survey a year or two ago, and they found that the attitudes were as poor among regulators as among academic researchers and industry in terms of the patient's perspective and really understanding what the patient, treating the patient like an expert, not just a pat them on the head, we're a partner with them, et cetera, not the patronizing typical view. So although it doesn't sound like much, I think it's a bit of a tip of the iceberg in terms of trying to start shifting the patient's role and even the patient's view of their own role and what their expectations are. I mean, we've heard horror stories about the healthcare delivery system, not unlike some of the things we've talked about in these meetings, where people talk about their encounters with the system and their encounters with trials. So I don't mean to indicate that that's the only thing, and I should have said maybe that we really see it playing out to a much larger set of agenda of things that have to be done, to the point of let's not waste people's time by not collecting the right information when they're here. Okay, let's make sure the data is correct and we're smart about what we're collecting, and it's so burdensome for them to sit there for all that history every time. They're telling us that's a problem, we can't do that, they don't want to be in our trials. It's going to start causing those kinds of changes. And so that's one thing I think we see, is that this is something that we hope has downstream effects, in fact, on other aspects of care as well, maybe if the information and that sensibility is there. The other just point I want to make, I have to leave at 3 o'clock and drive home to Virginia. So, but is that maybe to Rodrigo's point earlier about the decision, it very much depends on the decision, and I'll go back to my picture of benefit risk assessment decision, and maybe to what you were saying a little bit too, Susan, that we're looking for, our first look at real world evidence is going to be really looking at a particular decision context and saying, is it good enough? Is the information good enough to help reduce our uncertainty about what we don't know here? And it may not be pristine, it may not be perfect, but if we think it's sufficiently informative to help us better discriminate between the options, or should we put it on the market as a conditional approval and more data has to be collected? Is it not even good for that? There's a continuum of things we're trying to figure out. So we're sort of looking at real world evidence. In the case of cancer studies where, I think they're open to the idea that it's approved for one indication, let's look at real world or something like experience with doctors using it for other indications in cancer, where sometimes some of the data might be pretty good enough and might be controlled enough that we don't have to go through another trial. We could rely on the delivery system data. So I think we're viewing it as less sweeping and more kind of one application or use case at a time to see, can we do it? With what kind of data, what kind of decision? I think it's kind of how we're looking at it with FDA.
Theresa, we got an announcement from ASCO within the last week about a webinar and a meeting that FDA is holding for advocates November the 13th. Is that something that international patients could
Absolutely.
link into?
Yeah, our webinars are available, I think, anywhere if you can stay awake. Other side of the world would be. But yeah, no.
Is that part of your operation?
Full free. Not that one. We have a meeting, but we try to have all our public meetings now have a webinar aspect because people can't necessarily get there. That's been a big thing with these patient-focused meetings. We've had hundreds of people joined by the webinar because they just, they can do it that way. They can't.
Well,
get
from
there.
the announcement, though, it sounds very similar to, you wanting to know the advocate's role, the patient's role, various things. So it sounds very
We
similar.
have a
to what you're
lot of
talking
effort
about.
going on in this area. There's both the Center for Drugs is doing some, and our colleagues in the Center for Devices and Center for Biologics, and so there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and we're keeping it coordinated, but there's a lot we don't know.
I think it really raises two very important points. One is the voice, the patient voice element, making sure that what's truly important is captured and is considered. And that's so important because that really thinks about clinical trial design and data element capture and things like that. But also, maybe Norm, this gets a little bit to what you were saying. From a clinical trials regulatory perspective, historically, it's the data quality requirements, reproducibility, source document verification, etc., that bar that we're held to from an FDA audit perspective is very high. I don't even know if we should call it high. It's just very complicated. What you have to document to be able to justify, and industry can speak to this even more than I can, to justify that what you're submitting is accurate becomes really a challenge. It's why that patient wouldn't be counted as he's taking the drug, because unless it's documented in the medical record, our current system wouldn't acknowledge it as true. So it also sort of raises a question, I don't have the answer, but how do we capture reality, and how is that captured through clinical trial design, through what's necessary for a submission, through what even has to go into a clinical trial database build, what data elements do you need, and how is that audited? I mean, I think that's an issue.
Well,
So yeah, if you can be flexible.
one parting I mean, and actually, and there's, FDA is a very large agency, getting bigger all the time. And there's a kind of a enforcement arm. There's the police-like arm, and then there's the scientist kind of aspect to it. And we have at least we are supposed to move into a risk-based approach in terms of inspecting for compliance with the good clinical practices or the BIMO type of regulations and requirements. With that said, and I hope you're seeing, I hope you haven't seen some stuff like this recently from US investigators, but you are looking for a more risk-based approach. And then the question is the kind of quality deviation you're seeing causing the data that's going to be your decisions dependent upon? Is it really critical information that's messed up by this? Or is it less critical to the decision, less critical to the safety and effectiveness decision making? There's a lot of information, it's a reams of information collected that may not be that really critical. So for example, if you have the site where many clinical investigator sites, the site where most of the data is being collected has problems, that's a big problem, because that means most of your evidence is coming from a site that has problems and is suspect. So so that's a, you know, a risk-based approach. You have to think about the decision purpose. But the other thing I'll just say is there's two guidelines that made me come up with. One is the regulators are trying to be responsive to these things. So there's a new ICH guideline that's out for public comment right now. So it's globally available. It's called E9, and it's the estimand. And I think the estimand may sound like a kind of arcane statistical concern, but this is, the statisticians have said, make sure you know what question you're trying to answer and what is the uncertain quantity that you are trying to estimate when you're designing your trial. Now you might think, isn't that obvious? But it doesn't seem to be actually the question that's first asked in many trials. So the way data is collected and analyzed is to work around the fact that people drop out or they're using different dosages. The normal stuff that happens in care is not handled very well if you don't have a good idea what your estimand is, what's the objective of your study. So this guidance is coming out, and this is a global issue because I'll say some of the best statisticians in the world to put this together, but it's to really help to address at the front end some of that problem. And then the other thing is E6, which is the Good Clinical Practices. ICH E6 is the global, you know, standard for good clinical practices. It's mainly focused on site operations, so it's data integrity and human subject protection focused. So we're doing E8 over. That's clinical trial considerations of clinical trial design, and we're going to put in a quality by design approach to that, which it hasn't had before. Last time it was updated, actually it was written in 1997, hasn't been updated since. So it's getting updated to factor in the modern approach to think about clinical trial design. It's going to anticipate different types of studies, which are now the norm, not just RCTs.
Right.
We're then going to redo E6, so it is similarly focused on broad concepts for good clinical oversight of clinical trials, with annexes focused on different types of data sources and study types. So you're going to have one that's going to be traditional RCTs, but then you're going to have some that are on the range of what are normal now in real studies that are actually being done out there for smaller, you know, rare disease populations, et cetera. So we're getting there. It takes a while, but the good news is those are international standards that are getting updated.
That's great. I mean, I think that's so important because as you work with companies to do study design, ultimately, appropriately, the FDA as regulators have to hold us as investigators to the protocol document that we create. And so being able to have sort of have a new wave of thinking about what that protocol document should look like, then can change what the data element requirements are, that then can maybe give us more data elements that are more reflective of real world practice. And then it sort of harmonizes from there.
Yep.
Paul, you have any final comments?
Well, I echo your thoughts on medical transcripts not being accurate necessarily. I think you said that. I know my own experience. Just 2 weeks in a hospice, I reviewed the records and I saw a lot of problems. I don't want to rain on your parade, but you did talk about a issue of having tissues de-identified. Stanford and all these smart people thought that was great. I think it's lousy. And I'll tell you why, because things get lost. And I worked on a trial in Latin America, which I talked about earlier. You know what killed the trial? Was the transfer of tissue samples to OHSU in Portland. Things weren't getting there, and I don't know, maybe things have improved.
Well, I think tissue does get lost, but there's a difference between tissue sitting in a repository for a specific purpose and tissue sitting in a hospital waiting to be thrown out. So for sure in a hospital it's going to be destroyed. Okay? Not for sure in a setting that we have, it's probably not. So recently there's a group of researchers at Columbia Medical School in New York Presbyterian that started a collaborative project where they're looking at some work by it comes out of the lab they've run by a guy named Andrea Califano. And he's got some theories about master regulators and how to turn them off and what have you. He needed 100 vetted tissue samples in order for the study to proceed. Now there are 6 partners to this particular study. OHSU happens to be one of them. between New York Presbyterian and the 6 partners, they couldn't raise the 100 samples. The LifeRef group had them, and those 100 samples are sitting now in Califano's laboratory, vetted, compliments of storing it from, at a stamp. So it did work. I mean, the test of the pudding is, can it go wrong? Yeah, but we were able to identify the tissue and move it. And by the way, we're still applying for a grant for it, but we decided, the hell with it. We sent the tissue anyway. They actually started testing it anyway as well. I think, let me just wrap up. I think this is an incredible panel. It is in a very eclectic group of people. I think what we're all trying to do is to figure out, we're kind of like the proverbial blindfolded people sitting around touching a different part of a huge elephant, and you're looking at the tail and I'm looking at the trunk and what have you, and together maybe we can draw a picture of the whole thing. I think what we know about GIST, just the conclusion, is really the model for many other diseases. I mean, dealing with the subtypes of GIST, is really, it comes out only because of the scientific advancements of identifying these subtypes. Who would have thought years ago, when we all thought we were leiomyosarcoma, that you're now, you're not only CK positive, but you're a subtype of an exon 11, or you're now an SDH deficient, and what's more, you're SDHB deficient, and what have you. And what this has done is these scientific advances, oral drugs, the combination with textual have really created challenges for us in terms of data. And the data system has to change in order to do it. And part of it in terms of how can you figure out whether or not a data system is right. Well, what we used to do in public health, we would take a random sample, go into the system, pull 3% of the records, go back to the patients and say, by the way, are you Jewish? Are you Jehovah's Witness? Is this your right diagnosis? And if you find a disproportionate number of people who have bad data, then maybe there's a problem. One other piece of new world evidence that Theresa pat ourselves on the shoulder, we did a run recently, we compared the overall survival rates of patients who are members of the LifeRef group compared to the general population. And members of the LifeRef group have an overall survival rate for GIST over twice that of other people. Now, I can't prove that's anything that we did. They may have come to us to begin with like that. But I think part of it is the power of patient information. These patients are going to specialists because they preach it to each other on a daily basis. 15% of the general population has mutational tests. 65% of our population has tests. And the result of it is that you can make a difference. But I appreciate everybody coming here. If you've got to leave it at 3 o'clock, you got about 60 seconds. Okay, Suzanne, I'm going to let you say the final word because you didn't have the presentation.
Well, thank you so much. I think this was just a really wonderful panel to have, and so thank you for organizing it, and hearing everybody's perspective was awesome. Thank you.